Hello, my political scientists of DCL, STEM, and beyond. Today we're going to continue with Unit 4. We're going to do 4.3 and 4.4. These are definitely going to build upon the ideas that we learned about with the first two parts of the unit. So go back and watch those first if you haven't yet. So 4.3 is all about changes in ideology. And we need to think of what kind of things are agents that politically socialize an individual. So we learned a few of those last time. And we learned the number one agent of socialization is the family. So when you sort of figure, when Madison is figuring out what table to eat at, the table his family ate at is the number one factor that determines these things. So always keep that in mind. In fact, when presidential elections come out, they look a lot into school, like when the kids vote, because they normally will select who their parents will. So that's almost an early predictor of who will actually win the election. So keep that in mind. So we're going to have Madison take us through this journey again today. So some of the things that factor into this are things like family, race, religion, age, gender, region, and events. Please keep in mind that none of these are like 100% things, right? Just because you're of a certain gender or race or religion does not mean you have to like align politically with the majority of others in that demographic. It just helps to identify a trend. So, for example, I have a bunch of little examples here. So, the top left, that is, I know it might be hard to see, but that is who voted in the 2020 election based on age. And it was pretty evenly divided, except the younger people. 18 to 29 or so tended to vote more for Biden than for Trump. And then if you look below that, you'll see votes on gender. And you see the difference for men for 2016 to 2020, but for women, in both cases, women tended to vote more for the Democratic candidate, not by an overwhelming majority, but by a majority. On the bottom, or right here with my head, you see how religion can often influence voting trends. For example, um, people of Jewish faith, overwhelmingly about 70% voted for Biden, whereas white evangelical Protestants overwhelmingly voted for Trump. And on the top, that isn't actually election results, but those are percentages on vaccines. Now, that doesn't mean Republicans don't get vaccinated and Democrats do, but you seem to see trends in that as well, where the darker green is more vaccinations, and then those orangey colors are people or areas where there's very few vaccinations. So there could be reasons for that. Maybe there's less people there, so they see less of a need for vaccinations. But you just see how these sort of things can affect people politically and socially. Then, of course, we also have differences based on which generation people belong to. Now, oddly enough, the AP just focuses on these three generations: millennials, baby boomers, and the silent generation. So I feel like they sort of shaded me a little bit and left me out, but they left you out too. So we'll take issue with them together. So here's an example from this chart below. You see if you break down uh, votes by generation. Now, this chart refers to the silent generation as pre-boomers, which is, I don't hear that too often. Sometimes you do hear them also called as traditionalists. So let's learn a little bit. So just an FYI, millennials are those considered born in the early 1980s to 2000. Boomers, think of after World War II, so 1946 to 64. And then the silent generation are those born before 1945. And unfortunately, not a huge percentage of them left on this planet these days. So a little bit on millennials. They tend to vote more liberal on social issues, so things like should gay marriage be legal or legalization of marijuana, things like that. They are more in favor of using government steps to solve problems in the world. They're more in favor of environmental policies, things regarding like recycling and government regulations to help combat climate change. 70% consider themselves patriotic. I wish AP sort of tried to explain this more because it doesn't mean that like one party is patriotic and one party isn't. You see that sort of issue portrayed a lot in mass media. So what does that mean exactly, right? 55% of millennials consider themselves to be Democratic, whereas 27% consider themselves to be liberal Democratic. So what's the other mean? Well, the others might be considered more moderate Democrats, where they might not align 100% on a platform. Then we have baby boomers. Don't they look like they're all having a great time up there? 8 to 10 of baby boomers identify as being part of a religion, and that difference for about only 1 in 3 for millennials, and as many as 9 in 10 of the silent generation before them. 28% are non-whites when we look at diversity, compared to 21% of the silent generation before them, and increasingly 44% of the millennials are. And then, being brought up after a world war, 52% of them believe that peace can be sought through diplomacy, or should be sought by diplomacy more often, though, by signs of military strength. And as world events continue, it'd be interesting to sort of poll, because remember, these are just numbers. Um, hey, where's the rest? All right. Then we have the silent generation. Um, the silent generation. Oh, and I should have continued with the military issue. 77% of millennials favor seeking peace through diplomacy, or a little bit less, 43%, the silent generation do. Because think, I mean, it was their military strength that won the World War. So it's sort of natural to see those differences. Then when we look at the silent generation, um, when it comes to foreign policy, they view themselves as very anti-communist and very patriotic, once again, thinking of what they experienced in their youth. They are more like big fans of law and order, um, being tougher on criminals. And as far as social policy goes, they're sort of the other end of this spectrum. They're less likely to support things like gay marriage or legalizing marijuana or things like that. And that's why often they're referred to as traditionalists. Now, there's reasons why these generational effects sometimes can affect political things, because there's life cycle effects. Wherever you are in your stage of life is going to influence what you think is important politically at the time, and what do you think the political answers are at the time. So there is a shift in issues as people go through different periods in their lives. So think about it now. As you stand in a high school student, college loans might not be as much of an issue as you are when you're 80, right? So if we look at Madison, when Madison was a college student, um, student loans was a concern to Madison. Issues of finding employment, getting health care, right? Then when Madison was like a senior citizen and retired, he's right, enjoying life with a Hawaiian shirt, Social Security was an issue. Medicare was an issue. Prescription drugs is an issue. So it's natural for people to sort of change some ideas about how they view things in politics, um, based on what cycle of life they're in. Um, and we can talk about this more in class as well. And I want to keep in mind that the time that you're most impressionable, to sort of form these ideas is when you're from the ages of 14 to 24. So whatever life cycle experiences you have then are going to heavily influence the rest of your life. And think about it. Think about the news we look at every day. Do you think what's going on in the Ukraine now and how we respond as a country and as part of a globe will affect how you think government should respond later in your life? It might. You think the pandemic you guys have lived through and spent your high school years through is going to influence how you think about things politically later? Yeah, I'm really sure it is, right? So just think about how what you're experiencing now might influence you politically for decades and decades to come. So now that you've lived through these big events, let's think about what other big events previous generations have lived through. And that is 4.4, the influence of political events on ideology. And this is where we get some history in with our political science. So we want to look at as events as agents of political socialization. So because generations experience different historical events, they're going to tend to view different things regarding government and political events differently. So think about Madison if Madison lived through the Great Depression and he didn't even have a table to bring there was nothing on his table to eat. And Madison had to go to bread lines and soup lines. And thankfully, the government was often there to provide um, all sorts of things for Madison and others. So those individuals that lived through the Great Depression have more of a positive attitude on government because they saw how the government responded, right? They saw the government doing the New Deal and all sorts of things. So they're going to be more in favor of government intervention. Where imagine if Madison was around during World War II, right? That would influence them as well. They would understand and be in favor of seeing that the role of government is also to fight fascism. They would have a changing attitude of the role of woman is now maybe Madison was like working in a factory with Rosie the Riveters, right? Um, my grandmothers both worked during World War II, which was unusual compared to what their mothers and grandmothers did. And so think how that changed all sorts of political attitudes for them as they helped with the war efforts. Those who lived through World War II often displayed a greater sense of patriotism. That makes sense. And also unity. Remember, we talked the other day about does unity even matter anymore? Well, to this generation, it definitely does, right? Right. Then what if Madison lived through the 1960s and was a hippie, had beard and funky hats, right? Think of those that lived through the 1960s. Challenging government authority was normal then. Think of all the protests. Think of the civil rights movements. There's a reason why so many of these cases that we study come from the 1960s, right? We've learned about so many already. And then lastly, and I'm not so sure I agree with AP's take on this, but those who were young and lived through 9/11, how that changed their political socialization as well. I think region also plays a big factor in this. I put Madison with the bullhorn. You might remember Bush sort of standing with the firefighters saying, they will hear from us. AP wants you to take away that it made people more weary of government as afterwards we got involved with Iraq and Afghanistan. The video they made was before we left Afghanistan this August. But it mentions, but there was some patriotism directly thereafter. So I think for those of us, if you're in my class, you live near New York City. And I think the effects for us are different than it would be for maybe the rest of the US. So I would keep that in mind. All right. But naturally, that just shows how there's not a one size fit all for any of these. It's not a cookie cutter. This is just trends. One of many: family, events, religion, region, age, gender, race, right? So many factors. And you're not bound to any of them, but it does help identify changes over time. All right. So we'll talk about this in class. See you guys.